The coffee cup struck the kitchen floor at exactly 7:15 in the morning, and in the fractured silence that followed, Margaret Holloway understood that her entire life had been a carefully staged performance. She stood barefoot in her yellow cotton nightgown, the spreading brown stain at her feet like a map of some undiscovered country, while her husband Richard sat frozen at the breakfast table with another man's photograph in his trembling hands. "I can't explain," Richard said, but his voice was the voice of a stranger, small and desperate, and nothing like the confident baritone that delivered lectures on American literature at the college downtown. The photograph fluttered to the linoleum, a young man in swimming trunks, his smile bright and reckless, standing on a beach Margaret had never seen. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Through the kitchen window she could see Miss Patterson across the street watering her roses in perfect pink curlers, and beyond that, the milk truck making its rounds through their pristine Philadelphia suburb. The world was continuing exactly as it had, while hers cracked open like an egg. Richard's face had gone the color of old newspaper. "Margaret, please, we need to talk about this rationally." But rationality was for women who hadn't just discovered their husbands kept photographs of men hidden in the hollowed-out spine of a book about Hawthorne. Rationality was for marriages that meant what they appeared to me. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, her bare feet leaving tracks through the spilled coffee, and climbed the stairs to their bedroom with its matching twin beds and cheerful yellow wallpaper patterned with tiny daffodils. Everything in this house was yellow and white and clean and full. She dressed mechanically, the girdle, the stockings with their seams that must run perfectly straight, the navy shirtwaist dress with its dutiful row of buttons. Her hands knew these motions so well they required no thought, which was fortunate because thought itself had become impossible. In the mirror, her reflection looked like a woman in a magazine advertisement, the kind that smiled over laundry detergent and promised that cleanliness was achievable, that order could be maintained, that everything would be fine if you just followed the instructions. She was 32 years old, and she had followed every instruction. Richard didn't try to stop her when she walked out the front door. She drove without destination, her gloved hands gripping the steering wheel of their Chevrolet sedan, turning left and right through streets that grew progressively narrower and less familiar. The radio played Perry Como singing about catching a falling star, and she switched it off. The silence was better. The silence demanded nothing. She found herself eventually on a block she didn't recognize, where the houses were smaller and closer together, where laundry hung between buildings and children played stickball in the street. She parked the car and sat, watching life happen outside her windshield like a movie she had no part in. A colored woman passed by carrying a bag of groceries, her head wrapped in a bright scarf. 3 men sat on a stoop, talking and laughing. None of them looked up at the white woman in the nice car, or if they did they were careful not to show it. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time Richard had touched her with anything resembling desire. Their wedding night 4 years ago, perhaps, though even then he'd been apologetic and awkward, finishing quickly and turning away. She'd told herself all men were probably like this, that the romance in movies was just that, movie. She'd made herself into the perfect wife, learning to cook his favorite meals, keeping their home immaculate, laughing at his colleagues' jokes at faculty dinners. She'd believed that if she performed well enough, love would eventually appear, like a photograph developing in a dark room. The photograph of the young man on the beach. A tap on her window made her gasp. A colored man stood there, perhaps 40, wearing work clothes and a concerned expression that seemed genuine despite having no reason to be. She rolled down the window halfway. "Ma'am, you all right? You've been sitting here near about an hour." "An hour?" She glanced at her watch, surprised. "I'm fine, thank you. Don't mean to presume, but you don't look fine." He stepped back, giving her space. "Name's Thomas Caldwell. I live right there." He pointed to one of the row houses. "My daughter seen you through the window and got worried. Said you looked like her teacher did, right before she had that nervous spell." Margaret found herself laughing, though it came out strange and broken. "A nervous spell? Is that what this is?" Thomas studied her with careful eyes, the kind of careful that came from a lifetime of reading situations correctly. "Don't know what it is, ma'am, but you're welcome to come sit on our porch if you need to. Get some water at least. Hot day to be sitting in a car." She should have refused. Everything in her upbringing, in the unspoken rules of 1957 Philadelphia, said to refuse politely and drive away. But something in his weathered face, in the genuine concern that asked nothing in return, made her nod. She got out of the car on unsteady legs. The porch was small but tidy, with 2 wooden chairs that had been painted and repainted many times. Thomas disappeared inside, and returned with a glass of water beaded with condensation. A young girl appeared in the doorway, maybe 10, watching with solemn eyes. "That's my Ruthie," Thomas said. "Go on inside now, baby. Let the lady catch her breath." Margaret drank the water. It tasted like metal. "And Mercy, I'm sorry to trouble you. I was just driving and got lost." "Lots of ways to get lost," Thomas said, settling into the other chair. He didn't look at her directly, giving her privacy within the conversation. "Sometimes being lost is where we need to be, for a spell." She should have felt afraid, sitting on a colored man's porch in a neighborhood where she didn't belong. But fear required energy she didn't possess. Instead, she felt something like relief, the way a person might feel stepping out of tight shoes after a long day. "My husband," she heard herself say, then stopped. But Thomas just waited, patient as stone, and somehow she continued. "I discovered something about my husband this morning, something that changes everything I thought I knew." "That's a hard thing," Thomas said simply. "Thinking you know the shape of your life, then finding out you've been holding it upside down. You speak like someone who understands." "I understand that things ain't always what they seem. I understand that people carry secrets that would crush them if they spoke them out loud. And I understand that sometimes the person you thought you was married to is just a story you both been telling." Margaret turned to look at him then. Really look. His face was lined from sun and work, but his eyes were remarkably gentle. "Does that make me a fool? For not seeing? Makes you human. We all see what we're prepared to see. Nothing more." They sat in silence for a while. A breeze moved through, carrying the smell of someone cooking beans and fat back. Children's voices rose and fell in some game. The city hummed with its afternoon rhythms, and Margaret felt strangely held by it all. The ordinariness, the continuance of life despite personal catastrophe. "What do you do?" she asked. "For work. I mean, maintenance man at the Parker building downtown. 20 years now." He smiled slightly. "Keep the boilers running. Fix what breaks. Invisible work. Mostly. Long as things work right, nobody notices I'm there." "I understand that," Margaret said. "Being invisible while making everything run smoothly." Thomas nodded, and something passed between them then. A recognition that crossed the supposedly uncrossable lines between their worlds. 2 people who had spent their lives managing the machinery of other people's comfort. Over the following weeks, Margaret returned to that porch. She told Richard she was driving to clear her head, which was true enough. He didn't ask where she went, grateful perhaps for her silence about his secret. They moved around each other in their yellow and white house like diplomats from hostile nations, polite and distant and careful. On Thomas's porch she learned about his life in ways she'd never learned about any colored person before. Not as a category or a problem, but as a complete human being. He'd grown up in Virginia, come north after the war, lost his wife to cancer 3 years back. He read poetry, which surprised her. Langston Hughes mostly, but also Whitman and Dickinson. He kept a careful garden in the small square of earth behind his house, growing tomatoes and beans and marigolds. "My wife loved flowers," he explained one evening as he showed her the garden. "Marigolds, especially. Said they were like pieces of sun you could hold in your hand." Margaret knelt and touched a bright orange bloom. "They're beautiful. They're survivors," Thomas said. "Hardy. Forgive mistakes. You forget to water them for a few days, they bounce right back." She understood he was talking about more than flowers. Ruthie took to greeting Margaret with shy smiles, then gradually with stories about school and friends. Margaret found herself looking forward to these visits with an intensity that frightened her, not just because of what it might mean that a white woman was spending time in a colored neighborhood, though she was careful to park her car blocks away now and walk, but because these hours on Thomas's porch had become the only time she felt real. One evening in late August, as fireflies began their slow blinking in the gathering dusk, Thomas asked her what she planned to do. "About what?" she asked, though she knew. "Your marriage. Your life. Can't sit on my porch forever. Much as you're welcome to." Margaret watched a firefly trace its path through the air, Bright and then dark and then bright again. I don't know. Divorce would destroy him. Destroy both of us. Really. No one would understand. And staying is a kind of death. She said it plainly, surprised by her own honesty. We're both dying in that house. Pretending to be people we're not. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, my wife, before she passed, she told me something. She said sometimes mercy means letting go, even when holding on feels safer. She was talking about her own dying, giving me permission to live after. But I think it applies to other things too. You loved her very much. Still do. Love doesn't stop just because someone's gone. But love also means wanting the other person to be free, even if that freedom doesn't include you. Margaret felt tears on her face. The first she'd cried since that morning in the kitchen. I don't know how to be free. I don't even know what that would look like. Thomas handed her his handkerchief, worn soft from washing. Maybe that's what you gotta figure out. Not what marriage you can save or what life looks acceptable to other folks. But what freedom would mean for you, Margaret Holloway. It was the first time he'd used her full name, and hearing it felt like being seen by God, terrible and liberating at once. The conversation she finally had with Richard happened on a September evening when the air had turned cool and the light came through their windows at a slant. They sat in their living room with its matching furniture and its careful arrangement of books and lamps and photographs that showed a life that had never existed. I want you to be happy, she told him. Truly happy. Not this performance we've been giving. Richard's eyes filled with tears. I never meant to hurt you. I thought I could be normal if I just tried hard enough. I thought marriage would fix me. You're not broken, Margaret said, and meant it. But we're destroying each other pretending you are. They talked through the night. And for the first time in their marriage, they were honest. He told her about the man in the photograph, a student teacher he'd known in graduate school, about the constant terror of discovery, about the loneliness of loving what the world called unnatural. She told him about feeling like a prop in someone else's play, about the hollowness of being desired for what she represented rather than who she was. What will we tell people, Richard asked, as dawn began to lighten the windows. That we married too young. That we want different things. Does it matter? People will think what they'll think. You'll be all right? His concern seemed genuine, and she felt a wave of affection for him. Not romantic, but human. They were two people who had tried their best and failed, and there was dignity in that. I think I will be, she said. Eventually. The divorce took 6 months. Margaret moved into a small apartment near Rittenhouse Square, and took a job at a bookstore. Richard moved to New York, where rumors said he could live more freely, though neither of them spoke of such thing. Their friends divided themselves along complicated lines, and Margaret found she didn't care as much as she thought she would. She was learning to build a life from different materials than the one she'd been given. She didn't see Thomas during those months. It felt important to stand alone for a while, to discover who she was when she wasn't anyone's wife or anyone's anything. But she thought about him often. His quiet wisdom, his gentle certainty, the way he'd offered kindness without expecting anything in return. It was December when she finally drove back to his street, this time parking right in front of his house. She didn't care who saw. The fear that had governed her life felt like clothing she'd outgrown. Thomas was on his porch, despite the cold, bundling newspapers for recycling. He looked up when she approached, and his face broke into a smile that made him look years younger. "Margaret Holloway," he said. "Wondered if I'd see you again. Wondered if you'd want to." She said honestly, "Been hoping you would." He gestured to the chairs. "Though it's a bit cold for sitting outside. I don't mind the cold anymore. I've gotten used to discomfort." They sat, and Margaret told him about the divorce, the job, the tiny apartment with its single window, overlooking an alley. She told him how strange and frightening and exhilarating it was to wake up each morning and decide for herself what the day would hold. "That's freedom," Thomas said. "Scary as hell, but freedom." Yes. She looked at him, this man who had shown her what kindness looked like without conditions. "Thomas, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it for what it is, not what it might become. I care about you, more than I probably should, given how the world works. And I don't know what that means, or what we can do about it. But I needed you to know." Thomas's face went very still. "Margaret, you know what you're saying? What that would mean for both of us, but especially for me. I could lose my job. My home. Could be worse than that. I know. Her voice was steady. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to be honest with you, the way you've been honest with me. He was quiet for a long time, looking out at the street where evening was gathering like a held breath. Finally, he said, my wife used to tell me that the heart doesn't follow rules, doesn't care about what's proper or safe, and I've been thinking, since you stopped coming around, about what she'd want me to do. Not what fear would tell me, but what love would tell me. And what does love tell you? That you're one of the finest people I've ever known. That these months talking with you have been some of the best of my life. And that whatever this is between us, it's real and rare. And maybe that's enough. He turned to look at her then, his eyes holding equal parts hope and caution. But we'd have to be careful. More than careful. And it still might not be possible. I understand. Do you? Really? Because this isn't like your marriage, where you could eventually divorce and walk away. If we're seen together the wrong way, if people talk, it could destroy us both. And I got Ruthie to think about. She's all I got left in this world. Margaret nodded slowly. You're right. I was being selfish. I shouldn't have come. But as she stood to leave, Thomas reached out and gently touched her hand. The contact lasted only a second, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. Don't go yet, he said softly. Let's just sit a while longer. That much we can have. So they sat as darkness fell. Two people on a porch in a neighborhood where such sitting together defied every unwritten rule of their world. They talked about small things. The books Margaret was reading. The marigolds sleeping underground until spring. Ruthie's progress in school. They didn't touch again, but the space between them felt charged with possibility and impossibility in equal measure. Over the following months they constructed a friendship that existed in the margins of acceptability. Margaret would visit in the early evening. Before it got dark, they would sit on the porch and talk. Nothing that would scandalize from a distance. Sometimes Ruthie would join them, and Margaret would help with homework or bring books from the store. To neighbors, if they noticed at all, it might have looked like charity work, which had its own complicated dynamics but at least was comprehensible. But in the spaces between words, in the careful way they never quite touched, in the looks that lingered a moment too long, something else grew. Not passion exactly, but something deeper. A recognition of shared humanity, of kindred loneliness, of two people who had found in each other a place to rest from the exhausting performance of their daily lives. One spring evening, as they sat watching Ruthie play jump rope with other children down the street, Thomas said, "You know we're playing a dangerous game. I know, and you know it can't ever be more than this. These evenings, these conversations, the world won't allow it." Margaret was quiet, watching the children's rope arc through the air, their chanting voices bright and unconcerned. Maybe the world is wrong. The world being wrong. Don't make it less dangerous. No, she agreed. But it also doesn't make this less real. What we have, Thomas, even if it's just this, it's more honest than anything I had in my marriage. More honest than most people have in their whole lives. He smiled sadly. You always were better with words than me. That's not true. You're one of the most eloquent men I've ever known. He tasted the word. Never thought of myself that way. That's because the world never gave you room to think of yourself anyway but how it needed you to be. But I see you, Thomas Caldwell. All of who you are. His eyes glistened. And I see you, Margaret. See the woman you're becoming. Stronger than you know. The moment stretched between them, full of everything they couldn't say and everything they didn't need to. Then Ruthie came running up, breathless and laughing. And the spell broke into the ordinary magic of a child's presence. That summer Margaret was offered a manager position at the bookstore. It came with more responsibility and a small raise, enough that she could afford a slightly larger apartment, with a window box where she planted marigolds. She sent Thomas a photograph of them in bloom, and he kept it tucked in the book of Langston Hughes' poems he'd given her months before. They never became lovers in the physical sense. The risk was too great, the consequences too severe. But in every way that mattered, they loved each other. It was a love that existed in conversation, in shared silence, in the careful gift of a book or a packet of seeds, in the way they remembered each other's stories and sorrows. It was a love that asked nothing, and gave everything, that honored the impossibility of their situation, while refusing to be diminished by it. Years passed. The world around them began slowly to shift. Brown Board of Education had already happened, And now the news was full of lunch counter sit-ins and freedom rides. Thomas watched these developments with a mixture of hope and caution, knowing that change came at a cost usually paid by people who looked like him. Margaret involved herself in civil rights work, carefully, in ways that wouldn't directly endanger Thomas. She attended meetings, donated money, used her position at the bookstore to stock books by colored authors where they wouldn't otherwise be available. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough, but it was something. One evening in 1962, as they sat on Thomas's porch during an unusually warm October, he said, "Ruthie wants to go to college. Can you imagine, my daughter, going to college? She's brilliant." Margaret said, "Of course she should go to college." She asked if you'd help her with the applications. "Says you understand how those things work." "I'd be honored." Thomas looked at her, his face showing every one of his now 50-some years. "You know what you've meant to us these past 5 years. You know how you've changed our lives. Not as much as you've changed mine. We changed each other," he said simply. "That's what people do when they really see each other." Margaret felt the truth of this settle in her bones. She thought of the woman she'd been that morning in her kitchen, watching her coffee cup shatter, believing her life was ending. In a way it had ended, but something else had begun, something harder and lonelier and infinitely more real. She never remarried, neither did Thomas. They built their lives in parallel, connected by these evening conversations and the deep understanding that grew between them over years. When Ruthie went to college, Bryn Mawr on a scholarship Margaret had helped her find, she cried at her graduation, and afterward hugged Margaret with fierce gratitude. "You've been like a second mother to me," Ruthie whispered. "I hope you know." Margaret held her tight. This brilliant young woman who had let her into her life, who had taught her what generosity looked like across lines that were supposedly uncrossable. "You've been a gift to me," she whispered back. "Both of you." In 1967, when the Supreme Court struck down laws against interracial marriage in Loving, Virginia, Margaret and Thomas sat on his porch and listened to the news on his radio. When it was over, they sat in silence for a long time. "Could have saved ourselves a lot of heartache if that had come sooner," Thomas finally said. "Would it have changed anything?" Margaret asked. "Really?" He considered this. "Maybe not. We are who we are, and we've built what we've built, and I'm not sure I'd change it, even if I could. What we have, it's been pure because it had to be. No expectations, no demands, just two people, choosing to see each other clearly." "I love you," Margaret said. She'd never said it aloud before, though they both had known it for years. "I love you too," Thomas said. "Different from how I loved my wife, but no less real. Maybe more real, because it never had the chance to become ordinary." They sat as evening came on, two people who had found in each other an impossible home. The world around them was changing, slowly and painfully, but change. Ruthie would inherit a different America than the one her father had known, though still not an easy one. Margaret would spend the rest of her life trying to make that inheritance better, to push against the walls that kept people apart. But on that porch, in that moment, they had something the world couldn't touch. A recognition that love could exist in forms that had no name, that dignity meant honoring the truth of connection, even when it couldn't be consummated. That freedom sometimes looked like sitting beside someone you could never have while feeling more fully yourself than you'd ever been. The marigolds in Thomas's garden bloomed bright as pieces of sun. In her apartment across town, Margaret's window box bloomed too, the same variety, grown from seeds he'd given her. They were, both of them, hardy flowers, survivors, the kind that bounced back from neglect and flourished in unlikely places. As darkness settled over the city, Margaret stood to leave, as she always did. Thomas walked her to her car, as he always did. They said goodnight, keeping the careful distance they'd maintained for years. But before she drove away, she looked back to see him standing on his porch, silhouetted against the light from his open door, and she understood something profound. Love wasn't always about possession or permanence. Sometimes love was about seeing someone clearly, and letting them see you in return. It was about building small monuments to tenderness in a world bent on keeping you apart. It was about choosing, day after day, to honor the impossible thing you'd found together, even knowing it would never transform into the shape the world said it should take. As Margaret drove home through streets that glittered with evening lights, she felt at peace in a way she'd never imagined possible during that shattering morning in her kitchen 10 years before. She had learned that we contain multitudes, contradictions, and complications, Loves that make sense and loves that never will. She had learned that freedom sometimes means accepting what cannot be changed, while refusing to let it diminish what is. And she had learned, finally, that the deepest intimacy often exists in the spaces between what we desire and what we allow ourselves to have. In that space, if we're brave enough to inhabit it honestly, we discover who we really are, not the person we perform for the world, but the one we become when truly seen by another human soul. The weight of ordinary things, coffee cups and marigolds, evening conversations and books exchanged, a love that existed in glances and words and the careful architecture of restraint. These were what made a life, not the grand gestures or the acceptable narratives, but the small true moments we constructed from the materials at hand. Margaret parked her car and climbed the stairs to her apartment, where her marigolds bloomed in their window box and her books lined the shelves she'd built herself. Tomorrow she would wake and go to work, and live her carefully constructed life, but she would do so knowing that somewhere across the city, Thomas was doing the same, and that they carried each other in their hearts like talismans against the loneliness that threatened to consume them both. It wasn't the love story she'd been promised. It was instead the one she'd earned, complicated and impossible and utterly real, and in the end, that made all the difference. In the quiet of her small apartment, Margaret stood at her window and looked out over the city lights. She thought of Richard, living his truth in New York. She thought of Ruthie, blazing her path through a world that would try to contain her. She thought of Thomas, keeping the boilers running, fixing what broke, living a life of quiet dignity and deep kindness. And she thought of herself, the woman who had broken apart that morning in her kitchen, and reassembled herself into someone she could respect, someone who had learned that mercy means many things: letting go, holding on, creating space for people to be fully themselves, loving without consuming, seeing without possessing. She had learned that freedom and loneliness were often the same thing, but she had also learned that loneliness shared with someone who truly sees you becomes something else entirely. Not quite happiness, but something better. A recognition, a witnessing, a knowing that you are not invisible, that your life means something, even if only to one other person who chose to look at you clearly and love what they saw. The marigolds in her window box swayed slightly in the evening breeze, bright spots of color against the darkening sky, hardy flowers, survivors, pieces of sun you could hold in your hand. Tomorrow, she would visit Thomas's porch. They would talk about ordinary things and extraordinary things, about the world changing around them, and the things that never would. They would not touch, would not speak of the love that bound them, would give no one reason to notice or object, but they would see each other, and in the seeing they would be free. That, Margaret had learned, was enough. Sometimes more than enough. Sometimes, everything.